The afternoon sun was getting low when 16-year-old Zara finished her shift at the community center. She loved working there, helping younger kids with their homework and teaching them some basic sign language. Being deaf since birth, Zara had learned to see the world differently than most people. She could read lips pretty well, but sign language was her first language, the one that felt most natural to her. Today had been a good day. She'd helped a shy 7-year-old boy finally understand his math homework, and his huge smile when he got it right made her whole week. Now she was walking home through the quiet neighborhood streets thinking about the history project she needed to finish tonight. Zara always took the same route home, down Oak Street, then through the residential area with the nice houses and big trees. It was usually peaceful, and she liked watching people in their yards, kids playing on swings, dogs running around. The world might be silent to her, but it was never empty. She was texting her mom to let her know she'd be home in 10 minutes, when she noticed something in her peripheral vision. 2 police cars had turned onto the street behind her. Zara didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were pretty common in any neighborhood. But then she realized they were driving really slowly, almost like they were following her. Zara glanced back and saw 2 officers getting out of their car. One was tall and stocky with short brown hair. The other was shorter but looked more aggressive, with his hand already resting on his belt. They were both white, probably in their 30s, and they were definitely looking at her. The shorter officer started walking toward her, his mouth moving. Zara squinted, trying to read his lips, but he was too far away and speaking too fast. She couldn't make out what he was saying. She stopped walking and turned to face them, raising her hand slightly to show she was friendly. Then she pointed to her ears and shook her head, the universal gesture she'd been using since childhood to let people know she couldn't hear. But instead of understanding, both officers seemed to get more tense. The taller one put his hand on his weapon. The shorter one kept shouting something, his face getting red. Zara's heart started beating faster. She'd never had any problems with police before, but she'd heard stories from other people in her community. Stories about misunderstandings that went very wrong. She tried pointing to her ears again, then slowly reached for her phone. Maybe she could type a message to show them that she was deaf. Maybe they would understand then. The moment her hand moved toward her pocket, everything changed. Both officers drew their weapons, pointing them directly at her. Zara's blood went cold. She'd never had a gun pointed at her before. The fear was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She immediately put both hands up, way up in the air, trying to show them she wasn't dangerous. With her hands raised, she started signing frantically, "I'm deaf, I can't hear you, please don't hurt me," over and over as fast as she could. But to the officers, her rapid hand movements looked like something completely different. They saw a young black girl making what they thought were threatening gestures, refusing to follow their commands. The shorter officer was still yelling, his face now purple with anger. The taller one had moved to the side, creating what they call a crossfire position. Zara didn't know police tactics, but she could feel the danger in the air. She tried to mouth the words, "I am deaf," as clearly as possible, exaggerating each word. She pointed to her ears again, then to her mouth, trying to show them she couldn't hear or speak clearly. A few neighbors had started to come outside, drawn by the commotion. An elderly woman across the street was standing on her porch, her hand over her mouth in shock. A man was recording with his phone from behind a tree. Zara saw the neighbors and felt a tiny bit of relief. Surely with witnesses around, the police would be more careful. Surely someone would help explain that she was just a deaf teenager trying to get home. She was wrong. The shorter officer took a step closer, his gun still pointed at her chest. His partner moved even further to the side. Zara could see the tension in their bodies, the way their fingers were positioned on their triggers. She tried one more time to communicate. Slowly, carefully, she pointed to herself, then made the sign for deaf, pointing to her ear and then closing her hand. It was a simple, clear gesture that meant only one thing. But in the minds of 2 scared, poorly trained officers who had already decided she was a threat, her movements looked aggressive. They saw what they expected to see, a dangerous person who refused to comply. The taller officer shouted something to his partner. Zara could see his lips moving but couldn't make out the words. Whatever he said made the shorter officer's grip tighten on his weapon. Zara's phone was still in her hand from when she'd been texting her mom. She looked down at it, thinking maybe she could call 911. Maybe someone could help explain the situation. That glance down at her phone was the last normal moment of her life. When she looked back up, Both officers had their weapons trained on her, and she could see in their eyes that they had made their decision. They weren't going to listen. They weren't going to try to understand. In that terrible moment, Zara realized that all her life people had told her that being deaf was her biggest challenge. But right now, in this street with these two officers, being black was about to become a much bigger problem. The world seemed to slow down in those final seconds. Zara could see everything with crystal clarity. The way the afternoon sunlight caught the metal of the officers' weapons, the concerned faces of neighbors watching from their porches, the small yellow flowers blooming in the yard beside her. Officer Johnson, the shorter one, was shouting something that made the veins in his neck stand out. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, had positioned himself about 10 feet to the left, creating what police call a triangle of fire. Neither officer had any training in communicating with deaf individuals. Neither had been taught proper de-escalation techniques for people with disabilities. Zara's phone felt heavy in her hand. She looked down at it one more time, thinking maybe she could somehow call for help. Maybe text someone who could explain to these officers that she was just a scared teenager trying to get home from work. The phone's screen showed her last message to her mom. Almost home. Made tacos for tomorrow's lunch prep. Such a normal, everyday text. In a few minutes, it would become evidence in a federal investigation. When she looked up from the phone, Officer Johnson's face had changed. Something in his expression had shifted from confusion and anger to what looked like panic. "She's got a weapon," he shouted to his partner, though Zara couldn't hear the words. Officer Rodriguez, already on edge, took this as confirmation of his worst fears. In his mind, they were dealing with an armed, non-compliant suspect who had been ignoring lawful orders for several minutes. What they were actually dealing with was a 16-year-old girl holding a phone, trying desperately to communicate that she couldn't hear them. Zara saw Officer Johnson's finger move on his trigger. Some survival instinct kicked in, and she threw her hands up even higher, the phone flying from her grasp and clattering onto the sidewalk. She shook her head frantically, mouthing "No, no, no" as clearly as she could. The phone hit the concrete and the screen cracked. The sound made Officer Rodriguez jump. That's when Officer Johnson fired. The first shot hit Zara in the shoulder, spinning her around. The force of it knocked her sideways and she stumbled, trying to stay on her feet. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had pressed a burning iron against her skin. She looked down and saw blood spreading across her yellow work shirt. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. She'd been shot, actually shot, by police officers, for trying to go home. Before she could even fully understand what had happened, Officer Rodriguez fired too. The second bullet hit her in the leg, and this time Zara went down hard. She hit the sidewalk with her hands out in front of her, scraping her palms on the rough concrete. The pain in her leg was different from her shoulder, sharper, like someone was twisting a knife in her muscle. She could feel warm blood running down her leg, soaking into her jeans. Zara rolled onto her side, looking up at the two officers who were still pointing their guns at her. She was bleeding, she was terrified, and she still had no idea why this was happening to her. With her good arm, she tried to sign help over and over, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely form the letters. Officer Johnson approached her slowly, his weapon still drawn. He was shouting something, probably telling her not to move, but Zara was focused on trying to breathe through the pain. The elderly woman across the street was screaming now. The man with the phone was still recording, his hands shaking as he captured everything. Other neighbors had come outside, drawn by the sound of gunshots in their quiet neighborhood. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. "Oh my God, she's just a kid," another voice cried out. But the officers seemed more concerned with securing what they called the scene than with getting medical help for the person they'd just shot. Officer Rodriguez kicked Zara's cracked phone away from her, even though it was already several feet from where she lay bleeding. Officer Johnson kept his weapon pointed at her while reaching for his radio. Zara tried to focus on the faces of the neighbors who were watching. She could see their concern, their shock, their anger. At least someone cared. At least someone could see that this was wrong. She attempted to sign "I'm deaf" one more time, but the movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her shoulder. Instead, she just lay there, bleeding onto the sidewalk, wondering if she was going to die. The sound of sirens in the distance meant nothing to her, but she could see the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of nearby houses. Help was coming. Maybe. Officer Johnson was talking rapidly into his radio, already starting to craft the story that would justify what they'd done. Officer Rodriguez was looking around nervously, probably realizing that there were a lot of witnesses and at least one person recording video. As Zara lay there waiting for the ambulance, staring up at the sky that was starting to turn pink with sunset, she thought about her parents. Her mom would be expecting her home soon. Her dad would be getting off work in an hour, probably planning to help her with that history project. She thought about the little boy at the community center who had finally understood his math homework. She thought about the sign language class she was supposed to teach at the local library next week. She thought about all the normal everyday things that seemed impossible now. Most of all, she thought about how quickly everything could change. How a normal walk home could turn into the worst day of your life. How being different, being deaf, being black, could make you a target even when you'd done absolutely nothing wrong. The ambulance was getting closer. Zara could see the lights getting brighter. Soon there would be paramedics, people who were trained to help instead of hurt. But the damage was already done. The bullets were already fired. And somewhere across town, her parents were about to get the phone call that would change their lives forever. While the ambulance rushed Zara to the hospital, Officers Johnson and Rodriguez had about 15 minutes to get their story straight. 15 minutes to turn a tragic mistake into a justified use of force. 15 minutes to protect their careers and avoid accountability for shooting an unarmed deaf teenager. They started talking the moment the ambulance doors closed. She wasn't responding to any commands, Officer Johnson said to his partner, wiping sweat from his forehead. Completely non-compliant, made threatening gestures. Officer Rodriguez nodded, already falling into the familiar rhythm of post-incident story coordination. Suspected armed individual. Refused to show her hands when ordered. Made aggressive movements toward what appeared to be a weapon. Neither officer mentioned that Zara was deaf. Neither mentioned her attempts to communicate through sign language. Neither mentioned that the weapon was clearly a cell phone that had clattered harmlessly to the ground. Sergeant Williams arrived on scene first, followed quickly by Detective Brooks from the department's Internal Affairs Division. Both were experienced officers who had seen plenty of police shootings, and they knew exactly how these investigations needed to go. "Walk me through it," Sergeant Williams said, pulling out his notebook. Officer Johnson took the lead. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Subject matching the description was walking down Oak Street, acting erratically. When we attempted to make contact, she ignored verbal commands and began making threatening gestures." "What kind of gestures?" Detective Brooks asked. "Rapid hand movements pointing at us, aggressive posturing," Officer Rodriguez chimed in. "When we ordered her to show her hands, she reached for what appeared to be a weapon in her pocket." "That's when you fired?" "I fired first when she pulled the object," Johnson said. "My partner fired immediately after when the subject continued to move aggressively despite being struck." Detective Brooks wrote everything down carefully. This was the official version now. The one that would go in the report. The one that would be given to the media. The one that would protect the department from liability. But there were problems with their story, and some of them were becoming obvious very quickly. The biggest problem was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived across the street. She had called 911 herself and was now telling anyone who would listen that the girl was making those hand signs that deaf people use and clearly trying to show she couldn't. Here, the second problem was David Chen, a college student who had recorded most of the incident on his phone. He was already posting about it on social media, describing how the girl had been obviously trying to communicate that she was deaf, and how the police had completely overreacted. The third problem was the original 911 call. When investigators pulled the recording, they would find that the caller, a man named Robert Hayes, had reported seeing a black teenager walking through the neighborhood and described her as probably up to no good. There was no mention of weapons, no mention of actual criminal activity, just a racist assumption about a black girl walking through a predominantly white neighborhood. But for now, the officers focused on damage control. Officer Johnson walked back to where Zara's phone had fallen and examined it carefully. The screen was cracked, but the phone was clearly just a phone. No mistaking it for a weapon if you actually looked at it. "Make sure that gets logged as evidence," he told the crime scene technician. Subject was reaching for an unknown object that appeared threatening in the low light conditions. Officer Rodriguez was having his own problems. His body camera, which should have recorded the entire incident, had mysteriously malfunctioned. The camera showed clear video up until about 30 seconds before the shooting, then went to a black screen. Technical difficulties, he explained to Detective Brooks. These new cameras are always glitching out. It was a convenient glitch, the kind that happened with suspicious frequency whenever police officers needed footage to disappear. Johnson's body camera had also experienced problems, though his showed a different kind of technical issue. The audio was clear, but the video was jumpy and unclear during the crucial moments, almost like someone had been covering the lens with their hand. The department's public information officer, Lieutenant Sarah Miller, arrived to handle the media response. She had done this dozens of times before and knew exactly how to frame the story. At approximately 4:30 this afternoon, officers responded to reports of suspicious activity in the 200 block of Oak Street, she told the gathering reporters. When officers attempted to make contact with the individual, the subject failed to comply with lawful orders and made threatening gestures. Fearing for their safety, officers discharged their weapons. The subject has been transported to City General Hospital and is receiving medical treatment. She didn't mention Zara's age. She didn't mention that she was deaf. She didn't mention that she was unarmed. She used words like subject and individual instead of girl or teenager. The initial news reports that evening followed the police department's narrative exactly. Police shoot non-compliant suspect, read one headline. Officers use force against threatening individual, read another. Only the social media posts and witness accounts told a different story. David Chen's video was being shared rapidly, and people were starting to ask questions. Why hadn't the girl responded to police commands? Why were her hand movements so specific and repetitive? Why did she look so young? But the department had dealt with social media problems before. They had lawyers and public relations experts who knew how to minimize bad publicity. They had internal affairs investigators who knew how to find that officer-involved shootings were justified. Most importantly, they had a system that was designed to protect police officers even when those officers made terrible mistakes. Back at the hospital, Zara was in surgery to repair the damage to her shoulder and leg. The doctor said she would recover physically, though she would need months of physical therapy. Her parents had arrived and were sitting in the waiting room, trying to understand how their daughter had been shot by police for walking home from work. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to become part of a very familiar story. The story of a family seeking justice in a system designed to deny it to them. What they also didn't know was that Zara's father had spent 15 years learning exactly how that system worked, and exactly how to beat it. Detective James Williams was reviewing case files in his FBI office when his personal phone rang. It was 5:47 p.m. on what had started as a completely normal Thursday. He almost didn't answer. He was trying to finish up a report about police corruption in a neighboring county, and he wanted to get home to help Zara with her history project. But the caller ID showed his wife's number, and she never called during work hours unless something was wrong. "Hey, honey, what's up?" he answered, still typing on his computer. The sound that came through the phone made his blood freeze. His wife, Rachel, was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "James, you need to come to the hospital right now." "It's Zara. She's been shot." The words didn't make sense at first. Shot? Who had been shot? Not his Zara. Not his 16-year-old daughter who helped kids with homework and taught sign language classes and made terrible jokes about her favorite TV shows. "What do you mean shot? Shot by who?" "The police." Rachel managed to get out between sobs. "The police shot our baby." James's world tilted sideways. In 15 years as an FBI agent specializing in civil rights violations, he had investigated dozens of police shootings. He had seen the aftermath of police violence over and over again. He had comforted other families who had lost children to officer-involved incidents. But those were other people's children, other people's tragedies. This couldn't be happening to his family. "Which hospital?" he asked, already grabbing his keys and running toward the elevator. "City General." "James, there's so much blood on her clothes. They won't tell me if she's going to be okay." The 20-minute drive to the hospital took James through every stage of grief simultaneously. Denial. This had to be a mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. Anger. What kind of monster shoot a deaf teenager? Bargaining. Please God, let her be okay and I'll do anything. Depression. How did I fail to protect my own child? But underneath all of those emotions was something else. Something cold and analytical that came from years of investigating police misconduct. The part of his mind that was already asking the hard questions. What was the justification? Who were the officers? What was their training record? Were there witnesses? Was there video? James had spent his entire career seeking justice for families like his was about to become. Now he was living it from the inside. He found Rachel in the surgical waiting room, still wearing her scrubs from her shift at the pediatric clinic. Her face was streaked with tears and she was clutching Zara's backpack like a lifeline. What happened? James asked, pulling his wife into his arms. Through broken sentences and tears, Rachel told him what she knew. Zara walking home from work. Police officers stopping her. Some kind of confrontation, gunshots, an ambulance. They're saying she didn't follow police orders, Rachel said. But James, you know she can't hear them. You know she would never do anything to hurt anyone. James knew. He knew his daughter better than anyone in the world. He knew that she was gentle and kind and funny. He knew that she volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends and cried during sad movies and always remembered everyone's birthday. He also knew, with the cold certainty of 15 years investigating police violence, exactly what had happened to her. A surgeon appeared in scrubs, looking tired but reassuring. Mr. and Mrs. Williams? Your daughter is going to be fine. The bullet to her shoulder missed any major arteries and the leg wound was clean, in and out of the muscle tissue. She'll need physical therapy, but she should make a full recovery. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a different kind of pain. James hugged his wife and felt grateful that their daughter would live, would heal, would come home, but he also felt something else building inside him, something that had been growing since that first phone call. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes people do stupid things. The cold, focused kind of rage that comes from understanding exactly how broken the system is and exactly how many people have suffered because of it. James had investigated police shootings in 12 different states. He had seen departments cover up murders, fabricate evidence, destroy video footage, and intimidate witnesses. He had watched officers get away with killing unarmed children because the system was designed to protect them, not the communities they were supposed to serve. Usually he was the outside investigator coming in to seek justice for grieving families. He was the federal agent with the resources and expertise to take on corrupt police departments. Now he was the grieving father, and he had advantages that most grieving fathers didn't have. He knew how internal affairs investigations were conducted, and how they were designed to fail. He knew how police reports were written to justify any use of force. He knew how evidence disappeared and witnesses were discredited. Most importantly, he knew how to beat them at their own game. When they finally let James and Rachel see Zara, she was awake but groggy from medication. Her shoulder was bandaged heavily and her leg was elevated and wrapped. She looked so small in the hospital bed, so young and vulnerable. But when she saw her parents, she smiled and started signing weakly with her good hand. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Sorry I'm going to be late for dinner. Even drugged and traumatized, she was making jokes. Even after being shot by police for the crime of walking home while deaf and black, she was trying to make her parents feel better. James sat beside her bed and held her hand, and made her a promise in sign language. The people who did this to you are going to pay for it. Zara squeezed his hand and signed back, I love you too, Dad. She had no idea that her father was one of the FBI's most experienced investigators of police civil rights violations. She had no idea that he had spent years building cases against corrupt cops in bad departments. All she knew was that her dad was there, and that somehow everything was going to be okay. James kissed his daughter's forehead and stepped out into the hallway to make some phone calls. He had work to do. The officers who shot his daughter thought they were dealing with just another family of victims, people who would file a complaint, maybe hire a lawyer, and eventually accept whatever settlement the city offered to make the problem go away. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to destroy their careers, their reputations, and their freedom. The hunt was about to begin. The next morning, James Williams sat in his FBI office staring at his computer screen. On the surface, he looked like any other federal agent starting his day. Coffee getting cold, case files stacked neatly, federal building humming with quiet activity around him. But inside, he was planning a war. His first call was to his supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Hayes. They had worked together for 8 years, and she knew James as one of the Bureau's most thorough and relentless investigators. Patricia, I need to recuse myself from any local police matters for the next few months, he said, keeping his voice steady and professional. Everything okay, James? You never take time off. Personal family matter, but I'm wondering if the Bureau might want to take a look at the police shooting that happened yesterday on Oak Street. Young deaf girl, unarmed, shot twice by city police. There was a pause. Patricia was sharp, and she could hear something in James's voice that didn't quite fit. I'll have someone look into it. You sure you're okay? I'm fine. Just think it might be worth federal attention. What James didn't tell his supervisor was that the young deaf girl was his daughter. Federal agents weren't allowed to investigate cases involving their own families. Conflict of interest rules were strict and non-negotiable. But there was nothing stopping him from making sure the right information ended up in the right hands. His second call was to David Chen, the college student who had recorded the shooting. James had gotten his contact information from the local news reports, and he introduced himself as a concerned citizen who saw the video online. I just wanted to thank you for recording what happened, James said. That took courage. Man, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, David replied. That girl was obviously trying to tell them she was deaf. She kept making the same hand signs over and over. Anyone could see she was scared and confused. Have you given a statement to police yet? They haven't asked for one. I tried calling the department yesterday to offer my video as evidence, but they said they weren't taking outside submissions at this time. Of course they weren't. James knew that departments routinely ignored evidence that contradicted their official narrative. But federal investigators had different priorities. You might want to back up that video in multiple places, James suggested. Sometimes important evidence has a way of disappearing. After hanging up, James spent the next 2 hours doing what he did best, building a case file. But this time, he was working from the outside, gathering information that he would eventually pass along to his federal colleagues. He started with the officers involved. Personnel records were confidential, but James had learned over the years that a lot of information was publicly available if you knew where to look. Officer Johnson had been with the department for 7 years. James found 3 civilian complaints filed against him in the past 2 years, all involving excessive force, all dismissed by internal affairs as unfounded. One complaint came from a deaf man who claimed Johnson had roughed him up during a traffic stop when he couldn't respond to verbal commands. Officer Rodriguez had an even more concerning record. 9 years on the force, 6 civilian complaints, 2 involving allegations of racial bias. He had been sued twice by citizens claiming excessive force, and both cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. Neither officer had received any training in disability awareness or de-escalation techniques for special populations. James's phone rang. It was Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's Civil Rights Division in Washington. James, your boss asked me to take a look at a police shooting in your area. Can you brief me on what you know? Lisa was good, thorough, fearless, and absolutely relentless when she found evidence of civil rights violations. James had worked with her on several cases, and he knew she wouldn't be intimidated by local police departments or city lawyers. What I know is limited to what's been reported publicly, James said carefully.
16-year-old deaf girl walking home from work shot twice by police.
Department is claiming she was non-compliant and made threatening gestures. Deaf girl? Completely deaf since birth. Communicates primarily through sign language. There was a long pause. Lisa had investigated enough police shootings to understand the implications immediately. And the officer's justification is that she didn't follow verbal commands. That's what they're saying. Jesus, okay, I'm opening a preliminary inquiry. Can you put together a case summary with everything that's publicly available? Already working on it. This was how federal civil rights investigations began, not with dramatic raids or press conferences, but with careful documentation and quiet phone calls between experienced agents who understood how the system really worked. While Lisa began the official federal inquiry, James continued his own parallel investigation. He drove to Oak Street and walked the exact route Zara had taken, timing how long it took, noting sight lines and potential camera angles. He found security cameras on 3 nearby businesses. 2 weren't working, but the third, a small grocery store on the corner, had a clear view of where the shooting happened. James introduced himself to the store owner as an FBI agent, investigating police misconduct in the area. Technically true, even if he didn't mention his personal connection. I saw the whole thing, the owner, an elderly Korean man named Mr. Kim, told him. That poor girl was trying to tell them she couldn't hear. My daughter is deaf, I know those hand signs. Would you be willing to provide your security footage to federal investigators? The police already asked for it. I told them my system wasn't working that day. James raised an eyebrow. But it was working. Mr. Kim smiled grimly. Oh yes, it was working fine. I just don't trust those officers. They looked like they were already making up their story before the ambulance even arrived. Would you trust federal investigators? Much more than local police. James left the store with a promise that Mr. Kim would cooperate fully with any federal investigation. He also left with the knowledge that there was clear video evidence of the entire incident, evidence the local police department thought was destroyed. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Zara's asking for you. Can you come by the hospital? James drove to the hospital thinking about all the families he had worked with over the years. Parents who had lost children to police violence. Siblings who had watched their brothers and sisters get beaten or shot or killed by officers who faced no consequences. Now he understood their pain in a way he never had before. But unlike most of those families, he had the knowledge, resources, and federal authority to do something about it. When he got to Zara's room, she was sitting up in bed, looking much better. Her color had returned, and she was animated as she signed with her mother about something that had happened with the nurses. Hey, Dad, she signed when she saw him. Mom says you're working on my case? James sat down beside her bed. I'm making sure the right people are looking into what happened to you. Good, because those officers need to learn how to talk to deaf people. They could have hurt someone really badly. James almost smiled despite everything. Even after being shot, his daughter was worried about other people who might face the same situation. They're going to learn, he promised her. They're going to learn a lot of things they probably wish they didn't have to know. Zara squeezed his hand and smiled. She had no idea that her father was about to launch one of the most thorough federal civil rights investigations in the city's history. She had no idea that Officers Johnson and Rodriguez were about to discover what happened when you attacked the family of someone who knew exactly how to destroy corrupt cops. The investigation was just beginning, and James Williams was very good at his job. 3 weeks after the shooting, Agent Lisa Park was sitting in a conference room at FBI headquarters, surrounded by evidence that would have made any prosecutor's mouth water. She had worked civil rights cases for 12 years, but she had never built a case this airtight this quickly. The speed wasn't because of luck. It was because someone with intimate knowledge of police corruption had been feeding her information with surgical precision. James Williams had been careful never to cross ethical lines. He hadn't accessed any classified databases or used federal resources for personal purposes. Instead, he had done what any skilled investigator would do. He had asked the right questions, talked to the right people, and looked in the right places. The difference was that James knew exactly which questions to ask. Lisa spread the evidence across the conference table like pieces of a puzzle that told a devastating story. First, there was Mr. Kim's security camera footage. The video was crystal clear and showed the entire incident from start to finish. It showed Zara walking peacefully down the street texting on her phone. It showed the police cars approaching. It showed her obvious confusion when the officers started shouting at her. Most importantly, it showed her repeated attempts to communicate that she was deaf. The hand gestures were unmistakable to anyone who knew even basic sign language, pointing to her ears, making the universal sign for deaf, mouthing words clearly in an attempt to help the officers understand. The video also showed something the officers hadn't mentioned in their reports. Officer Johnson had drawn his weapon before Zara ever reached for her phone. The timeline in their incident report was completely wrong. Second, there were the body camera recordings, or rather the suspicious lack of them. Both officers claimed their cameras had malfunctioned during the crucial moments of the encounter. But FBI technical experts had examined the cameras and found something interesting. The malfunctions weren't random technical failures. They were the result of specific actions taken by the officers. Johnson's camera showed evidence that the lens had been deliberately obscured during the shooting. Rodriguez's camera had been manually turned off 30 seconds before shots were fired, then turned back on immediately afterward. Federal investigators had also discovered that both officers had attended a training session just 2 months earlier where they learned about body camera, technical issues that could help officers in difficult situations. Third, There were the witness statements that local police had never bothered to collect. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman across the street, had given a detailed account to federal agents. She described watching Zara making those hand signals that deaf people use and seeing her trying to show the officers she couldn't hear them. David Chen had provided his cell phone video, along with a written statement describing exactly what he had witnessed. His footage captured audio of Officer Johnson shouting, "She's got a weapon!" when Zara pulled out her phone, clear evidence that the officers had misidentified an everyday object as a threat. 3 other neighbors had also seen the incident and were willing to testify that Zara had appeared to be trying to communicate with the officers rather than threatening them. Fourth, there was the original 911 call that had started everything. The caller, Robert Hayes, had a history of making racially motivated complaints to police. In the past 2 years, he had called 911 17 times to report suspicious black people in his neighborhood. None of these calls had ever resulted in evidence of actual criminal activity. The call about Zara was typical. "There's a black girl walking through the neighborhood. She doesn't belong here. She's probably up to no good." No mention of weapons. No mention of actual criminal behavior. Just a racist assumption about a black teenager walking through a predominantly white neighborhood. Fifth, there were the officers' personnel files, which told a story of escalating complaints and inadequate supervision. Officer Johnson had been the subject of 4 excessive force complaints in the past 3 years. All had been dismissed by internal affairs, but federal investigators found a pattern of aggressive behavior, particularly toward minorities and people with disabilities. Officer Rodriguez had an even worse record: 8 complaints in 5 years, including 2 allegations of racial bias and 3 involving excessive force. He had cost the city $180,000 in settlements for previous incidents, yet had never faced any disciplinary action beyond additional training. Sixth, there was evidence of a systematic cover-up by the police department. Internal emails obtained through federal subpoenas showed that department supervisors had discussed managing the narrative within hours of the shooting. The public information officer had been instructed to emphasize Zara's non-compliance and avoid mentioning her disability. The department had also failed to interview key witnesses, lost some evidence, and rushed through the internal investigation with unusual speed. But the most damaging evidence was something the officers and their department never saw coming. Agent Park had discovered that Officer Rodriguez had been sending text messages to other officers immediately after the shooting. Messages that showed consciousness of guilt and a clear intent to coordinate their stories. "Stick to the script," one message read. She was non-compliant and made threatening gestures. Period. Another message was even more damning. Body cam issues worked out perfectly. No video of the actual shooting. The messages had been sent from Rodriguez's personal phone, but they had been captured by FBI surveillance technology during an unrelated investigation into police corruption in the department. As Lisa reviewed all the evidence, she realized she had something that rarely existed in police shooting cases: absolute proof of civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Most police shooting cases came down to conflicting accounts and incomplete evidence. Officers would claim they feared for their lives, and without video or strong witness testimony, it was nearly impossible to prove otherwise. This case was different. There was clear video evidence. There were multiple witnesses. There were text messages showing conspiracy. There was proof that the officers had deliberately disabled their body cameras. Most importantly, there was undeniable evidence that Zara had been shot for the crime of being deaf while black. Lisa picked up her phone and called the U.S. Attorney's office. "This is Agent Park with the Civil Rights Division. I need to speak with someone about federal charges against 2 police officers, and you're going to want to clear your calendar for this one." While Lisa prepared to present the case to federal prosecutors, James Williams was having dinner with his family for the first time since the shooting. Zara was home from the hospital, doing well in physical therapy and starting to talk about going back to school. "Any word on your case?" Rachel asked him quietly while Zara was in the kitchen getting dessert. "The federal investigation is moving forward," James said carefully. "I think there's going to be justice." What he didn't tell his wife was that in 24 hours, the FBI was going to arrest 2 police officers for violating his daughter's civil rights. He didn't tell her about the text messages or the body camera evidence or the systematic cover-up they had uncovered. He just hugged his family and felt for the first time in weeks like everything was going to be okay. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez were about to learn that some fights you can't win, especially when you're fighting someone who knows the system better than you do. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Zara had been shot. The FBI had chosen the federal courthouse for maximum impact, a building that represented real authority, not the local police department that had spent weeks covering up what happened. Detective James Williams sat in the back row of the packed conference room, wearing his best suit and a visitor's badge that identified him only as J. Williams, Federal Observer. To everyone in the room, he looked like just another FBI agent assigned to monitor a high-profile announcement. No one knew he was Zara's father. Agent Lisa Park stood at the podium flanked by U.S. Attorney David Morrison and Assistant Director Patricia Hayes. Behind them was a large screen that would soon display evidence that would shock the city. "Good afternoon," U.S. Attorney Morrison began. "Today, the United States Department of Justice is announcing federal civil rights charges against 2 officers of the Metropolitan Police Department in connection with the shooting of 16-year-old Zara Williams." The room erupted with camera flashes and the rapid-fire clicking of keyboards. This was the story everyone had been waiting for. Officers Michael Johnson and Carlos Rodriguez have been charged with violating Ms. Williams' civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and filing false official reports. These are serious federal crimes that carry potential sentences of life in prison. Morrison paused to let that sink in. Life in prison for shooting a deaf teenager walking home from work. The evidence we have gathered over the past 6 weeks tells a clear and disturbing story. Ms. Williams was shot not because she posed any threat to these officers, but because she was deaf and black, and because these officers were poorly trained, racially biased, and more concerned with covering up their mistakes than seeking justice. Agent Park stepped to the microphone. "Let me walk you through what actually happened on October 15th, based on video evidence, witness testimony, and the officer's own electronic communications." The screen behind her lit up with a still image from Mr. Kim's security camera. It showed Zara walking peacefully down Oak Street, her face visible as she looked at her phone. At 4:47 p.m., Zara Williams was walking home from her job at the Riverside Community Center, where she tutored children and taught sign language classes. She had done nothing wrong. She was not committing any crime. She was simply a teenager trying to get home. The image changed to show the police cars arriving. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez responded to a 911 call from Robert Hayes, a resident with a documented history of making racially motivated complaints about black people in his neighborhood. Mr. Hayes admitted in his call that he had no evidence of any criminal activity. He simply didn't think a black teenager belonged in his neighborhood. A new image showed the officers approaching Zara. When the officers attempted to give Ms. Williams verbal commands, she could not respond because she has been profoundly deaf since birth. Security camera footage clearly shows her attempting to communicate her disability through sign language. The screen now showed a close-up of Zara's hands as she repeatedly made the sign for deaf and pointed to her ears. Ms. Williams made the universal sign for deafness more than 20 times during this encounter. Any reasonable person watching this footage can see that she was trying to communicate her disability, not threatening the officers in any way. Agent Park clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of the shooting. Despite clear evidence that Ms. Williams was attempting to communicate that she was deaf, officers Johnson and Rodriguez chose to interpret her sign language as threatening gestures. When she reached for her cell phone to try to text for help, Officer Johnson shouted, "She's got a weapon!" and both officers opened fire. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of cameras recording everything. Ms. Williams was shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the leg. She was unarmed. She posed no threat to anyone. She was a 16-year-old girl trying to get home from work. U.S. Attorney Morrison returned to the microphone. But the shooting itself is only part of this story. What happened next shows a systematic effort by these officers and their department to cover up their actions and deny justice to the Williams family. The screen now showed text, messages between officers Johnson and Rodriguez. Within minutes of the shooting, These officers began coordinating their story through text messages. I'm going to read some of these messages verbatim. Morrison put on his reading glasses. From Officer Rodriguez to Officer Johnson, sent 12 minutes after the shooting. Stick to the script. She was non-compliant and made threatening gestures. Period. From Officer Johnson to Officer Rodriguez. Body cam issues worked out perfectly. No video of the actual shooting. From Officer Rodriguez, IA will back us up. They always do. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. These were not the words of officers who had made an honest mistake. These were the words of people who knew they had done something wrong and were actively covering it up. Agent Park returned to the podium. Our investigation found that both officers deliberately disabled their body cameras to avoid recording the shooting. Technical analysis proved that these were not equipment malfunctions, but intentional actions designed to destroy evidence. Morrison continued. The department's internal investigation was a sham designed to protect these officers rather than seek the truth. Witness statements were not collected. Video evidence was ignored. The Williams family was told their daughter had been shot because she failed to comply with lawful orders and orders she literally could not hear. This case represents everything that is wrong with police accountability in America, but today federal justice begins to address those wrongs. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, with prosecutors laying out additional evidence of racism, corruption, and cover-up that went beyond just these two officers. But James Williams was no longer listening to the details. He was watching the faces of the reporters and city officials in the audience, seeing their shock as they realized the scope of what had been uncovered. Then U.S. Attorney Morrison said something that made James's heart race. Before we take questions, there's one more thing you should know about this investigation. The speed and thoroughness with which we were able to build this case was due in large part to the expertise of FBI Special Agent James Williams, one of our most experienced civil rights investigators. James felt every eye in the room turn toward him as Morrison continued. Agent Williams has spent 15 years investigating police misconduct and civil rights violations across 12 states. He has a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and absolutely committed to justice. Morrison paused and looked directly at James. What you don't know is that Agent Williams is also Zara Williams's father. The room exploded. Reporters jumped to their feet. Cameras swung toward James, and suddenly everyone was shouting questions at once. James stood up slowly, straightening his tie, and walked to the podium. The room gradually quieted as people realized he was going to speak. My name is James Williams. I am a 15-year veteran of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. I am also the father of the 16-year-old girl who was shot by Officers Johnson and Rodriguez for the crime of walking home while deaf and black. His voice was steady, controlled, and absolutely furious. For 6 weeks I have watched these officers and their department lie about what they did to my daughter. I have watched them claim she was threatening and non-compliant when she was actually trying to tell them she couldn't hear their commands. I have investigated police corruption for my entire career. I have seen departments cover up murders, destroy evidence, and intimidate witnesses. I have seen officers get away with killing innocent people because the system is designed to protect them. James looked directly into the cameras, but these officers made one critical mistake. They attacked the child of someone who knows exactly how their system works and exactly how to tear it down. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez thought they were dealing with just another family they could silence with lies and intimidation. They were wrong. Today, federal law enforcement is sending a clear message. If you violate someone's civil rights, if you shoot an innocent person and then lie about it, if you think your badge gives you the right to hurt people without consequences, you will be held accountable. James paused, thinking about his daughter at home, working on her physical therapy exercises and planning to go back to school next week. My daughter survived because she's strong and because she had excellent medical care. But she shouldn't have needed to survive anything. She should have been able to walk home from work without being shot by the people who were supposed to protect her. These officers destroyed my daughter's sense of safety. They traumatized my family. They violated their oath and disgraced their badge. But today, they learn that justice is not just a word. It's a promise, and that promise is being kept. The room was completely silent except for the sound of cameras capturing every word. James Williams had spent his career seeking justice for other people's families. Today he had delivered it for his own. 6 months later, Zara Williams walked into the federal courthouse wearing her best dress and a smile that had taken weeks of therapy to rebuild. The trial of Officers Johnson and Rodriguez had become one of the most closely watched civil rights cases in years, and today was the day of sentencing. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, police reform advocates, and members of the deaf community who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. In the front row sat James and Rachel Williams, holding hands as they waited to see justice delivered for their daughter. Judge Elizabeth Chen had presided over the 3-week trial with firm control and obvious disgust for what the evidence had revealed. The jury had taken less than 4 hours to convict both officers on all charges, and their deliberation had been so quick that court staff barely had time to notify everyone to return. Now came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "The defendants will rise," Judge Chen said. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez stood with their lawyers, both men looking drastically different from the confident cops who had shot Zara 8 months earlier. Johnson had lost weight and looked haggard. Rodriguez couldn't stop his hands from shaking. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Chen began, "I want to address what this case represents. This is not just about 2 police officers who made bad decisions. This is about a system that allowed, encouraged, and covered up those decisions." She looked directly at the defendants. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Rodriguez, you shot an unarmed 16-year-old girl who was trying to communicate that she was deaf. You then spent weeks lying about what you had done, attempting to destroy evidence, and trying to blame your victim for your own failures. The evidence showed that Ms. Williams made the sign for deaf more than 20 times during your encounter with her. She pointed to her ears repeatedly. She mouthed the words, 'I can't hear you,' clearly enough that any reasonable person could understand. Instead of recognizing that you were dealing with a disabled teenager who needed help, you chose to see a threat that existed only in your own prejudiced minds." Judge Chen paused to let her words sink in. "The text messages you exchanged after the shooting show that you knew immediately that you had made a terrible mistake. Instead of taking responsibility, you chose to lie. You disabled your body cameras to hide evidence. You filed false reports. You attempted to destroy video footage. Most disgracefully, you tried to blame Ms. Williams for your own failures, claiming she was non-compliant and threatening when she was actually the victim of your incompetence and bias." The judge turned to address the packed courtroom. "This case has exposed systemic problems in police training, accountability, and culture that go far beyond these 2 individuals. But today, this court can only address the crimes committed by the defendants before me." She looked back at Johnson and Rodriguez. "Mr. Johnson, you have been convicted of violating Zara Williams' civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and filing false official reports. Taking into account the serious nature of these crimes, your leadership role in the cover-up, and your complete lack of remorse, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison." Johnson's knees buckled slightly and his lawyer had to steady him. "Mr. Rodriguez, you have been convicted of the same charges. However, the evidence showed that you were particularly aggressive during the encounter and that you fired the shot that could have killed Ms. Williams. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." Rodriguez closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. 15 years. He would be in his 50s when he got out. His police career forever over, his pension gone, his reputation destroyed. Both defendants will serve their sentences without the possibility of parole, as federal civil rights convictions do not allow for early release. Judge Chen then did something unusual. She asked Zara to approach the bench. Zara walked forward with confidence, her physical therapy having restored her full mobility. She stood before the judge and waited for permission to speak. "Ms. Williams, I want you to know that this court recognizes the tremendous courage you have shown throughout this process. You could have remained silent and tried to move on with your life. Instead, you chose to pursue justice not just for yourself but for every person who might face similar treatment in the future." Zara smiled and began to sign her response. A court interpreter translated for the room. "Your Honor, I want to thank you for listening to the truth instead of the lies these officers told about me. I also want to say that I don't hate these men. I'm sad for them because they let fear and prejudice turn them into people who could hurt an innocent person. But I'm not the same scared girl who got shot 8 months ago. I'm stronger now and I'm going to spend my life making sure this doesn't happen to other people." The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes, but the sentencing was only the beginning of the changes that followed from Zara's case. Within 3 months, the Metropolitan Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms. Every officer would receive 40 hours of training on interacting with disabled individuals. Body cameras could no longer be turned off during police encounters. The Internal Affairs Division was disbanded and replaced with an independent oversight board. The state legislature passed the Zara Williams Act, requiring all police officers to receive annual training on disability awareness and de-escalation techniques for special populations. The law also created strict penalties for officers who disabled body cameras or filed false reports. Most importantly, the case sparked a national conversation about the intersection of disability rights and police violence. Advocacy groups began working with police departments across the country to improve training and policies. Zara herself became a powerful advocate for change. She testified before Congress about the need for federal police reform. She worked with the FBI to develop training materials for law enforcement. She started a foundation that provided legal support for families affected by police violence. 1 year after the shooting, Zara stood before a packed auditorium at the annual conference of the National Association of the Deaf. She was there to receive an award for advocacy, but more importantly, she was there to deliver a message of hope. When those officers shot me, she signed to the audience, they thought they were dealing with someone powerless, someone who couldn't fight back, someone the system would ignore. They were wrong, not because my father happened to be an FBI agent, but because we live in a country where justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it. Every person in this room has power, the power to demand better, the power to hold people accountable, the power to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Those officers are in prison today not because of who my father is, but because we refused to accept injustice. We refused to let them get away with it. We refused to be silent. The audience rose in a thunderous standing ovation, hands raised in the air in the deaf community's sign of applause. In the back of the auditorium, James Williams watched his daughter with pride and amazement. The scared, injured teenager who had been shot for walking home had transformed into a confident young woman who was changing the world. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez had thought they could shoot an innocent girl and cover it up with lies and intimidation. They had thought their badges would protect them from consequences. They had been wrong about everything. Justice had been served. Change was happening. And Zara Williams, the deaf black girl they had tried to silence, had found her voice and was using it to make sure no one else would suffer what she had suffered. Sometimes the system works exactly as it should. Sometimes the people who think they're untouchable discover that no one is above the law. Sometimes a father's love and a daughter's courage can change everything.